what is that? I have no idea. Well, many, many years later, when I actually was the president's photographer, we were in San Antonio, Texas, where my parents were living at the time, and we had an event down on the Riverwalk, and afterwards my parents invited the White House staff over to their house for barbecue. So here I am, this hotshot guy, and the White House staff is coming over to my parents' house, and my mother has the White House staff there, and she says, I have to show you something David did as a little boy. I was like, oh, mothers, here we go. So what it was, she pulled out this photo album that I had done as a little guy, and I'd taken all these little snapshots and sewn it together with yarn and written in crayon, photos that I've taken by David Valdez. And so I guess somewhere, in here, I had that creative gene and was blessed to be chosen to be a photographer, and that was my career goal. My parents, my father actually was a Nixon political appointee and wound up moving to Washington, D.C., so I followed after I got out of the military and moved up to Washington, D.C., where I finished my degree at the University of Maryland, and started working for the federal government. And a few years into that, I was out on an assignment. I actually left the federal government, went to work for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in Washington, D.C. They published a magazine called Nation's Business, and I was the chief photographer for Nation's Business magazine. And the U.S. Chamber is right across the street from the White House. So I was on an assignment to photograph Barbara Bush, who at the time, this was in December of '83, she was the wife of the vice president at the time. And her job was to put a decoration on the top of the national Christmas tree. And I'm standing there with the press photographers, and one of the guys says, hey, did you hear that Vice President Bush's photographer just got a job at Time magazine? And kind of the light bulb went off in my head. I said, boy, I could do that job. And when you work for a political person, somebody who's gone through a campaign, you usually work on the campaign, and when your candidate wins, you usually get a job. Well, I didn't go that route. He had already been vice president, and he was already in office. So I knew I couldn't send a resume to the White House personnel, so I targeted where the vice president's photographer worked, and the vice president worked for the press secretary. And so I wrote a letter to Shirley Green, who's also a Texan down from San Antonio, and she invited me in, and we did an interview and talked, and I left there feeling pretty good, but she wanted me to come back and interview with Admiral Murphy, who was the vice president's chief of staff. And I went into that interview, and he beat me up, and he was pushing my buttons, and he was trying to get me to get upset, I believe. And I just yes sir, no sir, and thank you, and had my Texas way about me, but also my military background, and didn't let it get me up and angry. So I got called back to interview with Vice President George Bush. And so now I'm thinking to myself, I'm going on a job interview with the Vice President of the United States. I'm a guy from Alice, Texas. This is not something like in your genes. So I go in, and George Bush was the most gracious person I ever met. He's showing me around the Vice President's office, and there's some pictures there of his family and his grandchildren, and he's telling me, well, you're going to spend a lot of time with me in public and in private with family. You're going to hear a lot of things, see a lot of things, and you and I have to have a really good, close, trusting relationship. And I was saying, oh boy, yeah, I understand that. And I said, this is wonderful, but nobody's told me what the salary is. And he said, I said, do you know what the salary is? He says, I have no idea. And he said, well, let's call Admiral Murphy. So we're in the old executive office building, which is just across the parking lot from the White House and the Vice President's office. So the walls are kind of thin there, and he picks up the phone and he says, hey Dan, I'm in here with Dave Valdez. He wants to know what the salary is. And through the walls, I heard him screaming, what? He's asking you about salary? And I was like, oh. So anyways, it worked out. And so that was in December of '83. The Bushes went down to South Florida right after Christmas, and I had to go through the hiring process, and the Vice President is President of the Senate. So I was actually an employee of the United States Senate and had to go up to the Capitol building and be sworn in to be an employee of the U.S. Senate, working for the President of the Senate, the Vice President of the United States. And then after that, I was flown down to South Florida to tie up with the Vice President and start my time with him. And I land down there, and fellow picks me up, one of the White House advance guys, and he drives me out to where the Bushes were, and it was early in the morning, and he comes out to greet me, and he says, well, come on in, I need to introduce you to Barbara Bush. And we go in, and he introduces me, and we have breakfast, and I'm saying to myself, I'm here having breakfast with the Vice President and Mrs. Bush, my first day on the job, what's this going to be like? And so later on that day, we go up to South Florida. The president loved boating and fellow down there in South Florida had these big speedboats. And he said, well, let's take the speedboats up to Miami, and I'll go do my event. And why don't you, telling me, get in the helicopter and fly up and take pictures from the helicopters we're going up. So I had been a photographer in the Air Force, so I was comfortable with that. So we take off, and I take these pictures, and we get up to Miami. We go into the hotel suite, and his son Jeb was there, and Jeb and his wife had just had a new baby, and they're bringing the baby in to meet grandfather Ganny for the first time. And when Jeb comes in and he leaves the baby, I noticed that the people in the suite are leaving him, and I'm standing around. There's nobody there to tell me, do I stay? Do I go? What do I do? And in the history of White House photographers, there really haven't been that many in the history of the United States. And David Kennedy, who was President Ford's photographer, was one of the really pioneers in White House photography. And he had a lot of exclusive access to President Ford. So I was saying to myself, well, if David Kennedy were here, what would he do? He would go back in the bedroom with the Vice President and take some photos. So I went back in the bedroom and took some pictures, and Vice President's playing with his grandson for the first time. And then a few weeks later, I get a note from Barbara Bush saying, David, I love the photos that you took of George and little Jeb. As long as you take good pictures of my grandchildren, you can go anywhere and do anything you want. So I was golden. And so we went through the '83 re-election of President Reagan and Vice President Bush. And then I worked on the campaign when Vice President Bush ran for president and won. You'll see a couple pictures of that. While he was president-elect, he invited me. We were out at the National Geographic at an event, and we were going back to the Vice President's house in the motorcade. He invited me to ride in the limo with him, and he offered me the job to be the president's photographer. And so I said, I was kind of holding out for an ambassadorship, but I'll take it. and so let me show this video. Today's show, quite a few years ago, there's this young guy that looks kind of like me in the video. they did a feature piece on me, and they interviewed the president about me. But you'll see me working, and you'll hear some comments about my work, and it'll give you a real sense of the kind of things that I did. I traveled to 76 countries in all 50 states with the president. And why don't we run the video and turn it up a little.
There is one person who spends more time with President Bush than anyone else, and it's not his wife. It's a man whose name you probably don't know, but you do know his work. Valdez is the president's photographer, and he recently gave NBC's Jamie Gangel a personal tour behind the scenes of the White House. And that's where we find Jamie this morning. Hi, Jamie.
Good morning, Katie. Being the president's photographer is not an easy job. Dave Valdez has probably taken 1 million photographs of George Bush, never knowing which ones will go down in the history books. So he shares with us some of the public ones and some of the private, many of which have never been seen before.
The Constitution of the United States. So help me God. So help me God.
These are the images that make history, a president's legacy. Since Lincoln, photographers have captured the historic, the personal, the funny, the final day. Now it's Dave Valdez's turn.
I'm witnessing history, I'm recording history, and it will stay. And my photographs get used in the history books, and will be in the presidential library, and will live on and on and on.
On the road again. Just can't wait to get on the road again.
It's also an endurance test. Valdez has been with the Bushes for 7 years and has traveled so much, he's an official member of the president's Million-Mile Club. He works even when they sleep. From the Persian Gulf to Poland, he sometimes takes 1,000 pictures in a day.
You enjoy every moment and absorb it and remember it and photograph it and hope that you're contributing to history.
You get to tell who the real people are.
Sure. But I never say to you.
In fact, Valdez, always at the president's side, knows lots of secrets. But discretion and trust are at the center of this relationship.
It's important for him to have total confidence that he can close the door and be alone with his people and say whatever he wants to say and do whatever he wants to do without having the fear of me going out and telling the world. And I see it and I photograph it, but don't talk about it.
Another must for a White House photographer, Valdez knows sports. He knows baseball. He knows fishing. He knows tennis. He even knows diplomacy. It was Dave Valdez who taught Gorbachev how to play horseshoes.
I showed him once, and he tried it. First pitch, he made a ringer, and he walked off the court with the shoes. Classic moment in world history.
Valdez must also capture the more serious moments in world history, like the Persian Gulf.
This was just prior to the beginning of the Gulf War, when the president was out on the South Lawn walking around just kind of thinking about everything. He had been in the war himself and knew that he was committing sons and daughters of people, and some people were going to be lost, and that weighed heavily on him.
But equally striking are his pictures of Bush, the private man, the husband going off to work, the grandfather explaining balance of payments, the traffic cop, and then there's the wake-up call.
Here's one picture he took of you in bed. Forgive me. Do you remember the picture with all the grandchildren?
Oh, yes. Actually, we hadn't planned to do anything publicly with that, but you know, he may not like this, but Barbara and I consider him a part of our family, so he's welcome to go anywhere. And he just saw all that and clicked away.
Valdez says it's impossible to pick a favorite, but he does like a series known as the Fashion Line, the Bomber Jacket, the Red Sweater, the GQ. But which one is the real George Bush?
Katie, we call that last photo the trap. Dave Valdez insists that that is the real George Bush. One final note, Dave Valdez loves to joke that the best part of his job is that wherever he goes, they play Hail to the Chief and everyone stands up and applauds. But the truth is that he is a very unusual man in Washington. He is so modest that he still gets a kick out of seeing his photo of the president when he goes into the local post office or an elementary school.
Thanks a lot, Jamie. The trap's my favorite, too. And we're back in a moment with more on Today after this.